how did a software engineer in Leeds reverse engineer a social media algorithm to discover that simply typing the words native ancestry drops your visibility by a staggering 60%?
Yeah, it's a crazy statistic.
Right. And why did the phrase British culture cause his organic reach to just completely plummet by 42%? Like, what exactly is the digital architecture of our modern public square programmed to hide? And I guess more importantly, why is it hiding it?
That is the big question.
It is. Welcome to the deep dive. We are absolutely thrilled to have you here with us today for what is going to be an intensely detailed, highly analytical exploration. Before we get into anything else, please take a quick second to like and subscribe to this deep dive wherever you happen to be listening. It really helps us keep bringing you these incredibly thorough examinations of complex source material.
Absolutely.
Today, our mission is straightforward, but pretty ambitious. We are taking a stack of sources, and in this specific case, a highly provocative, deeply polarizing new ebook, and we are going to extract the absolute most fascinating nuggets of insight. We're really unpacking the architecture of an entire worldview here.
That is exactly the mission. Today we are examining a newly published and intensely debated ebook. It's titled Yookay, Init. Post-Great Rapid Replacement Colonization London is two-thirds foreign-born. The author is Conrad Reicher.
Quite a title.
It really is. Now, to give you the proper analytical context right out of the gate, it is crucial to understand the target audience and the stated intent of this text. This book is written very specifically for a men's rights, quote-unquote, red-pilled and manosphere audience. The author's explicit stated aim is to explain the history and the operational mechanics of Western institutions before, as he claims, they were entirely captured by a synthesis of modern feminists and cultural Marxists. So for those of you listening who are deeply invested in understanding the history of our institutions and how they operate today, this book aims directly at those questions.
And if this deep dive hooks you, and you find yourself wanting to examine the source material directly, like to really see the full scope of his arguments for yourself, check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book. Also, make sure to follow the author at the handle at Conrad Reicher on Substack.
Yes, definitely read the source if this interests you.
Now, before we get into the actual data and the philosophical arguments presented in the text, it's really important to set the ground rules for how we are going to navigate today's discussion.
Absolutely. This is a highly charged, deeply cultural, and aggressively political manifesto. It touches on race, gender, institutional trust, and the very fabric of modern society. So as always with our deep dives, our job isn't to take a side. We are not here to endorse Reicher's worldview, nor are we here to condemn or debunk it. Our role is strictly to act as your curious, objective, and analytical guides.
Exactly.
We're going to unpack the author's specific frameworks, we're going to examine the data points he chooses to present, and we are going to critically decode the ideological systems he is critiquing. Because whether you completely agree with his premises or whether you find his conclusions entirely objectionable, understanding the precise arguments circulating within this influential sphere is just absolutely vital for anyone trying to comprehend the modern cultural landscape.
Okay, let's unpack this. Reicher does not waste any time getting to what he views as the foundational reality of modern Britain.
No, he jumps right in.
The entire first section of his book revolves around demographic data and a concept he has termed the Great Silence. He points straight to the official numbers. He goes into the archives of the Office for National Statistics, the ONS, and he pulls the census data to make the claim that the native British population is essentially collapsing within its own capital city.
Right.
According to his rigorous parsing of the ONS data, London is now only 36.7% British-born. He uses this specific figure to hammer home his point that nearly two-thirds of the capital city is foreign-born, fundamentally altering the fabric of the nation.
What's fascinating here is not necessarily the data itself, like you noted. He is pulling from public ONS archives. It's rather the highly specific framework Reicher constructs around that data.
How so?
Well, in modern mainstream sociological discourse, a demographic shift of that magnitude in a major global financial hub is universally categorized under the umbrellas of diversity, multiculturalism, or globalization. Reicher categorically rejects all of that terminology. He refuses to use those words.
Yeah, he has a very different term for it.
He does. Instead, he describes this demographic reality as colonization without conquest.
Colonization without conquest. I mean, that is a highly aggressive, historically loaded phrase. He is deliberately invoking military and imperial terminology to describe immigration and demographic trends.
Precisely. By using the word colonization, Riker is arguing that this is not some organic, natural ebb and flow of global human migration. He frames it as a deliberate, top-down demographic engineering project.
Okay.
He distinguishes it from historical conquests, like the Norman invasion of 1066, because there are no standing armies, no declared wars. Instead, the author argues it is an administrative conquest facilitated by government policy and masked by a massive, overarching bureaucratic silence.
He writes this incredibly evocative passage about walking through the financial districts in the sprawling suburbs of central London.
Yeah, he notes that he hears more Bengali, more Arabic, and more Polish than he does English. And his core grievance here is that simply observing that empirical fact out loud, just stating what one's eyes and ears are processing, results in the immediate application of labels like bigot or racist.
Right. He argues that the basic act of pattern recognition, noticing that the demographic makeup of your environment has radically transformed in the span of a single generation, has essentially been criminalized as a social offense.
Yes.
And this brings us to a massive recurring theme in the book, the weaponization of language. Riker makes the assertion that left-leaning progressive ideologies did not achieve cultural dominance by presenting superior logical arguments in the public square.
No, he says they went after the dictionary.
Exactly. He claims they won by completely redefining the dictionary, altering the English language so that dissent becomes linguistically impossible.
He spends a significant amount of time detailing how, in his theoretical framework, language has been systematically inverted. It's almost an Orwellian critique, but applied very specifically to modern HR and diversity jargon.
Give us an example of how he breaks that down.
For example, according to the book, when institutions use the word inclusion, Riker argues that the functional real-world application of that word practically means the active exclusion and marginalization of the native working-class population.
Wow.
When policies champion equity, Riker does not see fairness. He argues the term is utilized as a specialized tool to enforce an ideological tyranny, particularly directed against men.
And he goes after the term toxic masculinity, too.
Very aggressively. When we look at a pervasive term like toxic masculinity, Riker posits that this phrase was socially engineered specifically to pathologize and criminalize completely natural traditional male behaviors, things like competitiveness, physical assertiveness, and stoicism.
And he emphasizes that this linguistic shift isn't an accident. Every one of these phrases, he argues, was designed to silence the public. The goal is to make you doubt your own eyes, to make you second-guess your own instincts.
Right.
But he draws a really crucial distinction here. He explicitly states that he does not believe this is some smoky room conspiracy where a cabal of elites plotted this out over cigars. Instead, he calls it a convergence.
A convergence, yeah.
That's a slow, steady, deliberate dismantling of classical values, reason, beauty, individualism, merit, and a gradual replacement of those values with collectivism, subjective emotion, and a hierarchy of victimhood. To explain how this convergence happened without a central conspiracy, he traces the ideology back to a very specific pipeline, starting deep within academia.
Yes, the concept of the Marxist pipeline is foundational to understanding Riker's diagnosis of the West. To explain this, Riker leans heavily into the political theories of Antonio Gramsci.
For those who might not be intimately familiar with early 20th century political philosophy, Gramsci was an Italian Marxist thinker, right?
Correct. He observed that the classical Marxist prediction that the working class would violently rise up and overthrow the capitalist system was simply not happening in Western Europe or America. The workers, generally speaking, were too content, or at least too tied to the cultural norms of their nations.
So the revolution stalled.
Exactly. Gramsci theorized that a socialist revolution in the West could never succeed through violent armed insurrection. The state was too strong, and the cultural baseline was too stable.
So, according to Rager's reading of Gramsci, the strategy had to change entirely. It couldn't be a physical war, it had to be a cultural one.
Gramsci proposed what became famously known as the Long March through the Institutions. The theory posits that to change a society, you must first achieve cultural hegemony.
Meaning, you control the ideas.
Right. You don't take the Capitol building by force. Instead, you quietly, methodically take over the institutions that produce the culture and dictate the boundaries of acceptable thought. You take over the teacher training colleges, the universities, the media syndicates, the entertainment industry, the student unions, and eventually the corporate human resources departments.
And Riker uses Gramsci's framework to explain how this revolution bypassed the barricades and instead captured the very infrastructure of Western thought.
Yes. The academics trained in this deconstructionist mindset became the professors, who trained the teachers, who trained the HR managers, who who now police corporate speech.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Riker doesn't just stick to this high-level, abstract political theory. He knows he has to prove this is happening right now, in real time.
And he brings receipts.
He really does. So he brings in some absolutely surreal, highly specific anecdotes from modern British universities to demonstrate his point. And I want us to spend some real time analyzing these examples, starting with the University of Sussex.
Oh, the geometry example.
Yes. Riker documents an incident, allegedly from a 2021 faculty meeting, where a professor declared that Euclidean geometry is a tool of colonial oppression. Euclidean geometry.
The math we've used for thousands of years.
The fundamental mathematical system we've used for over 2 millennia. Why on earth would that be deemed colonial oppression? Well, because, according to Riker's account of the meeting, in Euclidean space, parallel lines never meet.
Right.
And the professor supposedly framed this mathematical absolute as a metaphor for Western rigidity, inflexibility, and heteronormativity.
It reads like absolute satire, but Riker is adamant that the minutes of these meetings, the syllabus changes, and the ideological frameworks are entirely public and verifiable if one knows where to look.
It's just wild to think about.
By attacking Euclidean geometry, Riker argues, the institution is not actually talking about math. They are attacking the very concept of objective, unyielding truth. And he builds on this Sussex example with an even more extreme case study. He details a guest lecture he claims to have personally audited, or at least obtained the full materials for, in a university course literally titled Queer Mathematics.
Yes, the Queer Mathematics lecture. This is one of the most striking sections of the book. According to Riker's text, the instructor in this lecture argued that the entire system of binary numbers, specifically the use of 0 and 1 in computation and logic, inherently reinforces oppressive gender binaries.
And the proposed academic solution to this problem was the introduction of a concept called fluid numerals. The premise is that numbers should not have fixed, rigid values, but rather their values should change based on the emotional context of the person doing the math.
Fluid numerals.
If we really examine the philosophy underlying fluid numerals, we see exactly what Riker is warning his audience about. The instructor's argument, as Riker presents it, is that mathematical rigidity is a construct of Western patriarchal systems designed to exclude alternative ways of knowing.
How does that actually work in practice, though?
Well, Riker details how the lecturer proposed that the number 1 is not always objectively 1. Depending on a student's emotional state or their marginalized identity status, the value of that number could fluctuate.
The text provides specific examples from the lecture, right? Like, it suggests that the number 1 might be a 1 on Monday, but if the student is feeling non-binary or detached from rigid structures, that same integer could be interpreted as a 0.7 on Tuesday.
Exactly.
Or, perhaps the most memorable phrase Riker pulls from the syllabus, a number could mathematically equal 1.3 if the individual is experiencing what the lecturer termed a big energy day.
A big energy day.
Yeah. Riker uses this highly specialized, incredibly niche academic theory to make a sweeping argument that our universities are systematically replacing hypothesis testing, the scientific method, and objective logic with emotional truth narratives.
If we connect this to the bigger picture Riker is painting, he is arguing that the core operating system of Western civilization is being actively and intentionally deconstructed from the inside out.
The scientific method relies on the premise that truth exists independently of the observer's feelings.
Precisely. Riker posits that modern academia is teaching the exact opposite, that the observer's feelings, specifically their position on an intersectional hierarchy of oppression, dictate what is true.
And he mentions another syllabus overhaul to prove this regarding literature and history.
Yes, he points to a curriculum where traditional foundational texts by figures like William Shakespeare and Sir Isaac Newton were entirely removed. They were replaced with a dense 300-page academic critique titled Decolonizing Time, Queering Chronology in the Anthropocene.
Decolonizing time. And the central thesis of that 300-page critique, as Riker summarizes it, is that the very invention and standardization of clocks are instruments of capitalist and colonial control.
The concept of punctuality.
Right. The concept of punctuality, of showing up on time, of organizing a society around a shared temporal reality, is reframed and taught to students as a form of systemic oppression designed to police the natural rhythms of marginalized bodies.
Which brings us to a critical junction in Riker's argument, the psychological and cultural impact this has on the students themselves. Riker asks the reader to consider the real-world effect of an environment that pathologizes punctuality, mathematics, and objective truth.
What happens to a student in that environment?
According to the book, the immediate result is the creation of a massive, suffocating chilling effect on campus. He describes modern universities not as the classical sanctuaries of free thought and rigorous debate they were designed to be, but rather as deconstructionist sweatshops, factories designed to produce ideological conformity.
To ground this claim, he brings up a specific incident involving a student at Bristol University. According to Riker, this student arrived at a seminar simply wearing a plain, unbranded black t shirt. On the front of the shirt were printed just two words: free speech.
Nothing inflammatory?
Nothing. No targeted hate, just the philosophical concept of free speech.
And according to the incident report Riker cites in the book, within mere hours of that seminar beginning, a campus diversity officer officially reported that student-to-university
Security was called over a t shirt.
the justification for report.
Yeah.
The t-shirt was cited as an act of aggressively reactionary expression that was causing the emotional triggering of marginalized identities within the classroom. Riker posits this as empirical proof that the very concept of free speech is no longer viewed as a foundational right, but is now treated by university administrations as an active institutional threat.
He provides several more examples of this anti-debate culture. He points to a highly publicized debate at Manchester University that was physically shut down mid-event. Activists stormed the hall, pulled the fire alarms, and repeatedly screamed the phrase, "Debate is violence."
Debate is violence.
Riker makes a point to note that this isn't just a fringe activist slogan anymore. He provides evidence that the phrase, "debate is violence," actually appears in some official student orientation materials.
He also highlights a vote at the Oxford Student Union, where the student body voted to completely ban the use of the word mankind in all union communications. The reasoning given was that mankind represented species-level patriarchy.
So what do they replace it with?
They officially replaced it with the term human dinking.
Human kinking. Okay. Well, this raises an important question, and it is the exact question Riker is forcing his reader to consider. If the premier institutions of a society, the universities historically designed to protect rational discourse, cultivate debate, and train the next generation of leaders, are now explicitly teaching that the mere exchange of opposing ideas is an act of physical assault, what happens to the society built downstream from those institutions?
Riker's argument is that the students being molded in these intellectually restrictive environments do not stay on campus forever. They graduate.
Yeah.
And when they do, they become the human resources officers, the corporate policy writers, and the civil servants of tomorrow. They are being rigorously trained, he argues, not to think critically, not to question assumptions, and certainly not to debate, but rather to report, to censor, and to control.
Which provides a seamless transition into the architecture of Chapter 5 in his book, focusing on what he calls the bureaucratic takeover.
Yeah.
If the university is the training ground, the modern corporate office is the battlefield. Rakers argues that human resources has essentially become the new priesthood of our secular society, and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, what we commonly know as DEI, serve as their primary bureaucratic weapon to enforce moral compliance.
Riker describes this phenomenon as a hostile takeover from within. He uses the imagery of a siege where the invaders didn't need to batter down the corporate gates. They simply filled out the job applications for the administrative offices, one HR hire at a time.
A quiet revolution.
Exactly. To demonstrate how this ideology permeates state infrastructure, he cites a training video produced by the Ministry of Justice. According to Riker's breakdown of this video, civil servants are taught that traditional masculinity and Western historical narratives are social constructs designed exclusively to oppress marginalized identities.
And the examples used in this Ministry of Justice video are staggering. Riker claims the presentation explicitly uses images and clips of Winston Churchill, William Shakespeare, and Sir Isaac Newton, presenting all three of these historical titans as prime examples of toxic cultural gatekeeping.
Churchill, Shakespeare, and Newton.
Churchill, the wartime prime minister whose leadership was instrumental in defeating fascism in Europe. Shakespeare, arguably the foundational bedrock of the modern English language and literary tradition. Newton, one of the greatest scientific minds in human history. All of them flattened and labeled as toxic by modern bureaucratic standards.
Riker uses this Ministry of Justice example to argue that the concept of meritocracy, the idea that individuals should be judged and rewarded based on their competence, their output, and their objective value to society, is being systematically dismantled.
In its place, Riker argues, the administrative state is constructing a new, highly rigid caste system. He coins the term the grievance hierarchy or the victim calculus to describe how this new system operates.
The victim calculus.
Yeah. He specifically cites internal surveys and departmental guidelines from University College London, claiming that an astonishing 74% of sociology and gender studies departments there now formally argue that objective academic standards, things like requiring students to meet strict deadlines, demanding the use of formal logic in essays, or grading on a traditional A through F scale, are actual literal tools of white supremacy and oppression.
In this new hierarchy, Riker argues, the victim calculus dictates your social and professional worth strictly by your identity markers rather than your competence or your character.
And he makes it very clear to his specific audience. According to the rules of this new caste system, being a straight, white male places you at the absolute, indisputable bottom of the moral hierarchy.
But Riker doesn't just rely on academic theory here. He looks at the economic realities. He points to a highly revealing footnote buried in a 2021 McKinsey report to demonstrate the real-world consequences of replacing merit with identity.
This is a crucial data point in Raker's framework. McKinsey & Company, one of the most influential management consulting firms in the world, regularly publishes reports championing the business benefits of diverse workforces. However, Riker highlights a footnote in their own 2021 data showing that companies which implemented the most strict, unyielding diversity hiring targets actually experienced a 19% drop in overall productivity and a 27% increase in employee turnover and departures.
The data clearly indicated that prioritizing ideological metrics over raw competence was damaging the bottom line. And yet, as Riker points out, the push for these DEI targets within the corporate world only intensified.
And you have to ask, why? If the data shows it hurts the business, why do companies persist?
Riker's answer is that ideological compliance and environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, scores from massive asset managers matter more to modern corporate boards than raw productivity.
To illustrate the catastrophic endpoint of this mindset, he gives a highly detailed, almost tragicomic example of a modern tech startup.
Oh, the database story.
According to Riker, the CEO of this London-based startup went viral on LinkedIn, bragging extensively about hiring a, quote, non-traditional candidate for a senior database coding position. This individual possessed absolutely zero coding background, zero technical experience, and was hired strictly to hit internal DEI metrics and generate positive PR.
Riker tracks the fallout of this decision. 6 months into the role, this specific employee, lacking the fundamental understanding of software architecture, hard-coded a critical database path.
And then what happened?
Well, during a period of high user traffic, this error completely crashed the application's entire backend. The company hemorrhaged data, lost user trust, and because they could not recover the architecture quickly enough, the entire business was forced to shut down.
For Riker, that anecdote serves as a perfect microcosm of his broader societal critique. It is what happens when ideological compliance is allowed to supersede objective, unforgiving reality. Reality, Riker argues, does not care about your DEI statement. A poorly coded database will crash regardless of the HR department's intentions.
Alongside this critique of competence, Riker focuses heavily on what he terms performative empathy within both corporate and public spaces. He argues that modern institutions force their employees to participate in humiliating rituals to prove their loyalty to the new ideology.
Give us an example of that.
For example, he points to the corporate policies of Google's UK office in London. Riker claims that Google UK forces its employees to begin certain corporate meetings with formal land acknowledgements, where the speaker must take time to explicitly thank the indigenous peoples of London for the use of the land.
Which Riker analyzes as a profound historical absurdity. As he points out in the text, the history of the British Isles is a continuous overlapping succession of brutal migrations, conquests, and assimilations.
You have the ancient Celts, the Roman occupation, the Anglo-Saxons, the Viking incursions, the Norman conquest of 1066.
Right. To suggest that there is a singular, marginalized, indigenous group of London that must be acknowledged by a modern tech company is historically illiterate. Riker calls these land acknowledgements ritual humiliation disguised as virtue.
He argues that the corporate board knows it's historically nonsensical, the employees know it's nonsensical, but everyone is forced to participate in the collective delusion simply to prove they are compliant and will not cause trouble.
He finds similar examples of this ideological graffiti in the public sector. He mentions a specific fire station in Glasgow, Scotland. Historically, this station flew the Union Jack, but recently, the station leadership decided to take down the national flag and replace it with a year-round, permanently flown rainbow pride flag.
Riker's analysis of the Glasgow fire station is particularly revealing of his worldview. He does not view the raising of the pride flag merely as an act of inclusion. He views the taking down of the Union Jack as a deliberate act of historical erasure.
In what way?
In Riker's framework, the Union Jack represents hundreds of years of shared history, continuity, the social contract, and the ultimate sacrifice of public service, values essential to a functioning fire department. By replacing that symbol with a flag representing modern subjective sexual identity, Riker argues the institution is signaling that it has surrendered its traditional stoic duty in favor of chasing the latest emotional trend dictated by progressive culture.
And this concept of institutions surrendering their traditional values deeply impacts how individual men are treated within society, which takes us directly into a really core foundational part of Riker's thesis, the feminist fracture and the crisis of masculinity. If there is one through line in this entire book tailored to his specific manosphere audience, it is the assertion that traditional masculinity is not just undervalued, but is under active systemic attack.
Riker argues that the classical virtues historically associated with masculinity, traits like stoicism, fierce discipline, the capacity for delayed gratification, physical resilience, and emotional compartmentalization in the face of crisis, are now actively pathologized by modern HR departments.
He notes the deep historical irony here.
Exactly. These are the exact virtues praised by the Stoic philosophers, by Enlightenment thinkers, and by the builders of the Industrial Revolution. But today, in a corporate environment that prizes emotional vulnerability, bringing your whole self to work, and endless empathy, these traditional masculine traits are viewed as liabilities, or worse, as indicators of latent toxicity.
He gives a very concrete example of how this plays out in the modern workplace. He details the case of a man working in a London Municipal Council office who was formally suspended in 2023 pending an HR investigation.
What did he do?
Well, during a resource allocation meeting, he simply pointed out, using objective attendance records, that a female colleague had missed 38 days of work over a 6-month period for unspecified personal reasons, and that this absenteeism was impacting the team's output.
That's a lot of days.
Right. And the female colleague filed an immediate HR grievance claiming his statement caused her severe emotional distress. The result? The man who pointed out the data was suspended and ordered to undergo mandatory conflict resolution therapy to check his tone and practice corporate empathy.
Riker uses this council office incident to argue that the man was explicitly punished for his competence. He was punished for noticing empirical facts, for expecting a basic standard of professional accountability, and for prioritizing the objective output of taxpayer-funded work over the subjective emotional comfort of a colleague.
And this specific dynamic leads Riker into what is undoubtedly the most complex, highly theorized psychological argument in the entire book, his conceptualization of modern leftism as a form of maternal imperialism.
Yes, the infant predator schema. This is arguably the intellectual centerpiece of his text, and we need to spend some time breaking down exactly what he means by this. How does Riker connect HR policies to biological psychology?
So, Riker theorizes that the biological evolutionary maternal instinct, the innate drive to fiercely protect, nurture, and shield the vulnerable from harm, has been decoupled from the traditional family unit. In modern progressive spaces, he argues, this maternal instinct has been inverted, scaled up, and weaponized at a societal level.
He argues that this ideology essentially treats all of society like a giant, heavily padded nursery.
Exactly. Within this framework, adult men, particularly those exhibiting any form of traditional unapologetic masculine traits, are treated either like misbehaving, unruly toddlers who need to be constantly scolded, taxed, and re-educated, or they are viewed as dangerous predators who must be contained.
So if we look at this maternal framework, if men are cast as the predators or the unruly toddlers, how does the system view the people it designates as the marginalized or the victims?
According to Riker's schema, the designated victim groups, whether categorized by race, gender, or sexual identity, are treated by the state as perpetual infants. They are granted infinite unconditional protection. Their emotional outbursts or failures are always validated as righteous trauma.
And crucially, Riker argues they are never held personally accountable for their own actions or shortcomings because the maternal state considers them too fragile or too systemically oppressed to bear the weight of personal responsibility.
The psychological implications of this are massive. Riker argues that this schema completely erases personal agency on both sides of the equation. It creates this bizarre psychological drama where men are essentially born with a modern version of original sin. They are deemed guilty, privileged, and toxic simply by virtue of existing as men.
Meanwhile, the groups designated as infants possess a sort of political immaculate conception where they can do no wrong, And any failure on their part is always the fault of the systemic patriarchy.
And Riker claims this psychological fracture, this state-sponsored maternal imperialism, is leading directly and predictably to the collapse of the traditional nuclear family. He argues the state is actively replacing the father.
He brings some financial data into this as well. To back this up, he pulls up a 2023 Freedom of Information request regarding government spending. He reveals that over £28 million in UK public funds, taxpayer money, were actively funneled into various feminist non-governmental organizations.
NGOs.
Right. According to Riker's review of their literature, these specific NGOs actively campaign against fathers' rights in family courts. They lobby to diminish the importance of marriage, and they push to minimize male presence and authority in primary education.
He is incredibly critical of how these activist groups influence actual policy and criminal law. He points to a highly controversial legal case in Scotland to demonstrate how far this has gone.
Oh, the BDSM case?
Yeah. The case involved a man who was criminally prosecuted because his girlfriend expressed postcoital regret several days after a weekend of mutual, consensual BDSM play. The text makes it clear that there was no allegation of non-consent or force in the moment. The acts were negotiated and agreed upon, but because her feelings about the encounter changed days later, the state pursued charges.
Riker frames this Scottish case as a terrifying legal precedent. He argues it represents modern feminism shifting away from the classical standard of clear affirmative consent and moving toward a framework of consequence management for female impulsivity.
Consequence management.
Yes. In Riker's view, the state is utilizing its legal monopoly on violence to protect women from the emotional consequences of their own autonomous decisions, while placing the entirety of the legal risk squarely on the shoulders of the male partner.
He also tracks this maternal forming into the political arena. He cites the Labour Party's 2023 Birmingham mayoral shortlist. This list featured 3 female candidates, all of whom were childless, lifelong political careerists, while mothers with executive experience were conspicuously absent.
Riker posits that the modern feminist state does not actually want mothers in positions of real power. His reasoning is that women who are actual mothers tend to think long-term about family stability, economic safety, and objective reality, whereas childless careerists, unburdened by generational loyalty to a family unit, are far more likely to push abstract, disruptive identity politics.
All of this, the HR policies, the legal shifts, the political shortlists, Riker argues, is meant to systematically dismantle male agency and fracture the traditional family. In his deeply traditionalist worldview, the nuclear family is the only institution that truly civilizes young men and organically nurtures future generations without state interference.
And he observes that this process of state interference begins very early in a citizen's life, which brings us to his scathing analysis of the education system, a chapter he dramatically titles The Death of the Trivium.
Let's talk about the trivium. For listeners who might not have studied classical education models, the trivium consists of 3 foundational pillars: grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Grammar is the mechanics of language.
Right. Logic is the mechanics of thought and analysis, and rhetoric is the mechanics of persuasion and communication. Riker says this classical foundation, which built the Western mind, is dead and buried in modern public schools.
To prove it, he cites a 2023 report from Ofsted, the official government body that inspects and regulates schools in England. The Ofsted data reveals a staggering statistic. 62% of England's state secondary schools no longer teach a full, unabridged Shakespeare play to students in Key Stage 3.
62%. To illustrate exactly why this statistical decline matters so much to cultural continuity, Riker details a specific curriculum swap that occurred at the Ark Evelyn Grace Academy, a secondary school in London.
According to the school's updated syllabus, they completely removed Shakespeare's Macbeth and replaced it with a modern young adult fiction novel titled A Beautiful Lie.
Now, Riker is careful to acknowledge that the YA novel might be a perfectly fine, entertaining story, but his critique is about depth and cultural inheritance. He argues that replacing Macbeth, which is a profound, foundational exploration of raw ambition, crippling guilt, the nature of fate, and the psychological corruption of power, with a simplistic modern YA book, is a tragedy.
He claims this swap is done purely to hit diversity and relatability metrics, entirely at the expense of profound psychological, philosophical, and literary depth.
He frames this as the deliberate erasure of the Western canon. The great books are being hidden from the next generation. And he points out that this ideological conditioning starts way before high school. It begins in primary school, with the youngest, most impressionable children.
He investigates primary school reading materials and finds that the Department for Education reportedly spent £2.3 million on diversity resources. One of the crown jewels of this funding was a children's book titled My Dinosaur Friend is Gender Fluid.
My dinosaur friend is gender fluid.
This is a book aimed at young children about a triceratops in a tutu who identifies using they-them pronouns.
For Riker, a book like My Dinosaur Friend is Gender Fluid is not about teaching basic kindness or anti-bullying. He argues it represents state-funded ideological grooming from the top down. It is the active deconstruction of objective biological reality in the minds of toddlers.
He connects this early erasure of logic and objective truth directly to what he calls the mental illness epidemic currently ravaging modern youth.
Riker is fiercely, uncompromisingly critical of the medicalization of what he views as normal adolescent confusion. He argues that teenagers have always been awkward, uncomfortable in their changing bodies, and desperate to find an identity that makes them unique.
But today, he argues, the medical and educational establishments are weaponizing that anxiety. He shares the heavily documented case of a 14-year-old boy in Manchester who was officially referred to a medical gender clinic for evaluation simply because a school counselor praised the boy's, quote, non-binary energy.
The boy wasn't suffering from severe dysphoria. He was just an introverted kid who wasn't stereotypically hypermasculine.
And he follows that with an even more tragic, irreversible example. The story of a 13-year-old girl from Newcastle. According to the medical records Riker cites, this young girl was prescribed cross-sex hormones, specifically testosterone.
At 13.
At 13. She experienced rapid, irreversible physiological changes, including a permanently deepened voice and altered bone structure. And then just 11 months later, she detransitioned. When asked why she went through with the initial medical pathway, her stated reason was that she just wanted to fit in online and find a community on social media that would accept her.
This raises a massive, profoundly important societal question that Riker is forcing his readers to confront directly. How should a healthy society handle normal, albeit deeply painful, adolescent awkwardness and social anxiety?
Riker's argument is that a healthy society provides stable family structures, clear, unyielding boundaries, and an education rooted in rigorous logic and objective reality to help adolescents navigate that turbulent period.
Instead, he argues, our current society, captured by maternal imperialism, is handing deeply confused, socially anxious children life-altering hormones, celebrating their medicalization as stunning courage, and aggressively silencing any parent or doctor who urges caution.
He views this entire paradigm as institutional medical malpractice wrapped in a shield of ideological possession.
And the obvious question anyone reading this book would ask is, how is this ideology spreading so fast, and how are the millions of people who object to it being kept so quiet? Why isn't there massive, organized pushback?
That brings us right back to our hook at the beginning of the show and the final major section of Riker's analysis, the media matrix and algorithmic censorship.
Yes, Riker argues that the reason you don't hear mainstream, overwhelming public pushback against these radical cultural changes is due to a phenomenon he terms digital castration. He returns to the findings of that software engineer based in Leeds. This engineer set up a rigorous digital experiment.
He created identical social media accounts and posted identical messages regarding immigration and culture, only changing a few key phrases to test the algorithm's boundaries.
The results of that experiment are wild. The engineer found that the algorithm actively, programmatically suppressed posts containing specific terms. If a post included the phrase native ancestry, its visibility plummeted by 60% compared to the control group.
And if the post used the phrase British culture, the reach dropped by 42%.
Riker backs up this anecdotal experiment with peer-reviewed data. He cites a comprehensive Stanford University study confirming that social media posts questioning the wisdom of open borders or expressing skepticism about mass immigration receive 68% less organic reach than identical posts that support progressive immigration policies.
The algorithms are literally throttling the visibility of dissent. He also points to a well-known historian on YouTube. This creator posted a purely data-driven, highly academic video titled The Demographics of London, 1950 versus 2023.
The video contained zero commentary. It was literally just animated charts based directly on the government's own Office for National Statistics data. Within 24 hours, YouTube fully demonetized the video and restricted its algorithm recommendations, citing a violation of policies for promoting racial resentment.
Riker's conclusion from all this data is chilling. He argues that the digital algorithms that govern our modern public square do not care about objective facts. They're not programmed to facilitate debate. They are specifically trained by their Silicon Valley creators to aggressively suppress words, concepts, and even raw government data that make progressive ideology uncomfortable or reveal its flaws.
But Riker doesn't just lay the blame at the feet of tech executives in California. He takes direct, highly targeted aim at legacy state broadcasters in his own country, specifically the BBC. He describes the BBC as a funhouse distortion of reality.
He argues it has been entirely captured by a metropolitan, university-educated elite, a managerial class who have never held physical working-class jobs, yet presume to dictate morality to the rest of the nation.
He provides a perfect example of this cultural disconnect. He mentions a viral interaction on Twitter involving a construction worker from Liverpool. This guy posted a standard photo of himself on a job site lifting steel beams, clearly proud of his labor.
Riker documents how several prominent verified media types, journalists, and producers associated with mainstream networks quote-tweeted the photo to openly ridicule the worker. They mocked him for his traditional masculinity, with one caption sneering, "Imagine still doing manly jobs in 2024.
Riker uses this interaction to brilliantly illustrate how the modern media matrix actively, openly sneers at traditional working-class masculinity and the people who actually build the physical infrastructure of the country.
He also critiques the BBC's institutional programming, specifically how they have mainstreamed highly controversial academic theories as unquestionable facts. He notes that the BBC heavily promoted concepts from Robin DiAngelo's deeply polarizing book, White Fragility.
Riker points out that the state broadcaster actually ran a segment with the literal title, "Is Your Whiteness Making You Racist?"
For Riker, this crosses the line from public interest journalism into state-sponsored psychological warfare. He argues the goal of such programming is to instill a paralyzing sense of historical guilt in the native population, effectively making neutrality or pride in one's heritage impossible.
Okay. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We have examined his interpretation of the demographic shifts and the ONS data. We've unpacked his Gramscian analysis of the capture of academia, Euclidean geometry, and the death of the trivium.
We've explored the bureaucratic takeover of corporate HR departments and McKinsey data.
We've taken a deep dive into his psychological theories regarding maternal imperialism, the feminist fracture, the crisis of masculinity, and the collapse of the nuclear family. And we've looked at his evidence for the algorithmic censorship and media matrix keeping this entire system in place.
It is a massive, incredibly dense, interwoven worldview. Given all of this, what is Conrad Riker's ultimate call to action for his readers? How does he tell his audience to respond to this?
Riker's concluding message to his specific audience, men who feel deeply alienated, silenced, and disenfranchised by these rapid institutional shifts, is actually surprisingly grounded and focused. He does not call for political revolution or despair. First and foremost, he tells them to stop retreating into the digital world.
He urges them to log off the algorithms that are designed to demoralize them, and instead to build real, tangible, face-to-face brotherhoods in their local communities.
He wants his readers to actively reject what he calls the simulation of modern Britain, a fake, ideologically captured, HR-managed version of reality that he mockingly refers to as Yookay.
His most direct, tactical instruction to his audience is incredibly simple. Say the forbidden words. He tells them to talk openly about demographic reality, talk about the erosion of native culture, point out the absurdities in HR policies.
But he emphasizes that they must do so calmly, entirely devoid of anger, using unassailable data, and absolutely refusing to be shamed, fired, or bullied into silence by the Great Silence.
He genuinely believes that objective truth is inherently contagious, and that when enough people simply stand up and state empirical reality out loud, the spell of this entire ideological convergence will inevitably shatter.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this analysis, it is important to reiterate our objective stance. Whether you find Conrad Riker's perspective to be a vindicating, brilliant articulation of the modern condition, or whether you find his arguments fundamentally flawed and utterly abhorrent, there is absolutely no denying the sociological impact of this text.
His book clearly highlights a profound, vibrating fracture in modern Western society that cannot be ignored or simply censored away. The deep anxieties he is tapping into, anxieties regarding the dizzying pace of cultural change, the rapidly shifting roles and expectations of men and women, the perceived loss of institutional neutrality, and the erosion of a shared national identity. These are very real, potent forces that are actively shaping our politics and our culture today.
Absolutely. It's a raw, unfiltered look into a worldview that is gaining massive, undeniable traction online and in the broader cultural discourse. It demands to be understood. If you want to dive into the actual text we've spent the last hour meticulously reviewing and decode his arguments for yourself, I highly recommend checking out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Yookay Init. And make sure to follow the author at Conrad Ringrecker on Substack to see how his theories are evolving in real time.
And please, if you appreciated the depth and objectivity of today's analysis, remember to like and subscribe to this deep dive. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing you these extensive, uncompromising breakdowns of today's most polarizing, complex, and fascinating texts.
I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We spent a long time discussing Riker's assertion that the West is deconstructing its own foundations. Based on everything we've unpacked today, if a society systematically dismantles the traditional symbols, the classical literature, and the historical heroes that historically forged its unique identity, what exactly is left to bind its citizens together in shared sacrifice when a real existential crisis hits? Think about that. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next Deep Dive.